Okay, good morning again. Mine is showing it on Robin. I hope it'll switch. Um, Good morning again. And this is our 19th session of doing this stuff. And we're in the rules for discernment. And we're in the rules for discernment the second week. Um, so I want to just go back and review and why we're doing all this. And I spent some time this past week in the different translations. And one of this whole thing, these spiritual exercises, the whole Ignatian thing has been quite a challenge for me. And part of it is all these different translations. And so we've moved. I've tried to do a translation. I'm going to keep working on that. Um, Lately we've gotten to one from this book, which is what we're going to next, God's Voice Within. And then, but this week I was dealing more with this book, the contemporary translation, because it's just easier to it's easier to follow his language. The language is very challenging. And so, any rate, I just want to back up a little bit and talk about why we're doing this in the first place. And that is that I've been a very moody person, had a lot of ups and downs all my life, in and out of feeling okay, and finding these definitions of desolation and consolation has just helped a lot in terms of understanding my own moodiness. So that's one thing. Um, and the other thing, as a result of spending some time in this book, The Purpose Driven Life by Rick Warren, and you have to get by the Jesus stuff, but once you're by that, it's just full of good questions and good quotations, and it's really gotten me uh, much closer to thinking about what is my creator's purpose for my life as opposed to my ego personality's purpose for my life. I've always been ego driven, and I would even say my bondage of self is that I'm driven by what my own ego seems to want out of my life. And I've been miserable pretty much most of my life. And I had to drink, and then I went through this, 10 years of getting sober, and then go back to this consolidated, concentrated period of misery that took me as far down as I've ever gone. And coming back from that has just been as much of a shift in my way of life as getting sober was a shift in my way of life. And so I've come to really value these things, but I'm just stating, um, I believe that the the primary step for me is step 11. That that step 11 is suggesting I'm praying only for knowledge of God's will for me, and I can easily translate to that, to God's purpose for my life. Um, and as soon as I do that, it just changes the ball game, because it's not. I feel like I've seen pretty clearly my ego's purpose for my life, and it basically wants to feel good, and it's involved. I've said it a number of times. Its primary purpose is self-preservation. I don't think the soul cares about that, because the soul knows it's living forever, or it's a much more eternal thing than the temporal human ego. um, Self preservation, self gratification, feeling good at any, just trying to feel good instead of feeling miserable, and then self justification, justifying my personal selfish behavior. So this idea that God, my creator, has a purpose for my life, um, is inspiring for sure, because it takes me out of the ego's purpose for my life. And um, and I feel God's purpose for my life is to be the best, most contributing member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous that I can be. I do believe it's one of the things that Rick Warren talks about in Purpose Driven Life is our relationship to the church. And all I got to do is changed church to fellowship, and I find that I'm um, inspired by the work that the fellowship does, and want to be a contributing member of that. And it's just changed everything. So last week I want to start with the end of last week, which was the end of the first week. But this time I'm working out of this more modern translation, and it really doesn't matter what you're working from. It's just hearing the stuff, and it really takes a while to sink in, I believe. But the end of the first week, so this would be rules number, um, oh, I'm back on the original one. Hold on. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Here I am confused with my own stuff here. There it is. Okay, so now I'm working from this contemporary translation, but it won't matter if you're looking at God's voice within that translation. That'll be okay. So rule number 9 is about these 3 important reasons why we go through desolation. And the first reason was it's our own fault. We've um, not doing our spiritual drill. We're not going to meetings. We're not asking for help. We're not engaged in our process. Second reason for desolation was God testing and strengthening our relationship to God. And the third reason was that this is the only way most of us get to humility. And humility is understanding that everything in my life is the gift and the grace of God. That's and my ego is constantly trying to take credit for what I'm experiencing, which is a real challenge. So that's rule number 9. Rule number 10 is talking about dealing with consolation and what we are to do when we identify that we're in consolation. 10 was about get ready for the next desolation, and 11 was about the opportunity for growth in true humility. And he gives us 3 different situations to watch the ego do its thing. The first situation was the spoiled brat, and how to deal with a spoiled brat. And he basically says, when you're firm with a spoiled brat, the spoiled brat will back off. But if you're weak with a spoiled brat, it lets itself go and gets really angry. That was 1. That's 12. 13 was the evil spirit's behavior can be compared to that of a false lover. The false lover wants to operate in secret. The false lover doesn't want anybody else knowing about it. And it's really about one of the marks of being in desolation is that we move to secrecy. We are not open and transparent with the other people in our lives. And finally, the last one, number 14, was about the ego as a shrewd military commander. What the ego is going to do is look for the weaknesses in our program. Where am I not? Where am I weakest? And then attack at that point. So that ends the first week and brings us into the second week. And the distinction between the first and second week is simply that the second week we're growing, we're further along in this spiritual path. Um, and I just want to read you the first one, that the first rule of the second week. This is a contemporary translation. When we are trying to follow the loving invitation of God in our life, we will find that the good spirit tends to give support, encouragement, oftentimes even a certain delight in all our endeavors. So it's saying, I believe, that when I am in sync with God's purpose for my life, I feel good and I feel this encouragement, support, and all of that. The ego, on the other hand, does just the reverse. Let's see. Okay, now, yeah, does just the reverse. And um, this translation says the ego will subtly arouse a dissatisfaction with our own efforts, raise doubts and anxieties about God's love or our own response, and will upset our conscience by suggesting thoughts of pride in our attempt to lead a good life. So the ego is going to want to take credit whenever it can. So that takes care of uh, the first rule of the second week. The second and the third rules of the second week are about consolation and talking about uh, we know the experience of having certain thoughts, achievements, events which bring about a feeling of great consolation in our lives, but they're going to distinct this one. Rule number 2 of the second week is about consolation without previous cause. And what it's saying is that yes, when you are active in your prayer life, you're reading inspirational material, you're engaged in service, all of that stuff, you feel good, and we naturally attribute it to we're doing our spiritual drill. Consolation without previous cause is where um, we have an experience of God, but we can't take any credit for it. The ego, we can't attribute it to anything that we've done. It just happens. And I've said before in AA, we people refer to this as a God shot, that I experience higher power but I have nothing to do with the experience of that. So then what they're going to do is when you're experiencing this consolation without previous cause, you have to be careful because it is a inspirational experience, and they say in rule number 3 that you have to be very careful about the after effect of this consolation, that we tend to move into a manic sort of state, and that's a challenge. So when you get to rules 4 and 5 and 6, they're talking about what Mark Thibodeaux calls false consolation, where I'm feeling good, but kind of like being in a manic state, I suppose you would say. And they bring up these different elements of that, and one of them is called the false angel of light, where a solution appears to me to help me in my misery, and I pursue that solution, and I inevitably wind up dissatisfied with what um, the results of doing that. So, rule number 4, I'm reading this contemporary translation from I think Draw Me Into Your Friendship, which is a book by David Fleming. This is his contemporary translation. Rule number 4: for a person striving to lead a good life, the evil spirit, and I'm substituting ego for that, ordinarily appears like an angel of light. We find ourselves inspired by pious thoughts, holy desires, and then we get caught up in pride in our own thinking and in the selfishness of our own desires. So, one of the things they're going to try to train us, that he's trying to train us to do, is to look at the whole course of thought. Because what the ego does is it starts off good, and then it takes us to its own desires and intentions. So I'm going to read you, this is the rule number 5 um, from the second week, a contemporary translation. We can grow as discerning persons by examining carefully the whole path our experiences have taken us. In reflecting on the course of our thoughts and actions, we find that from beginning to end, our eyes have remained fixed on God. We can be sure that the good spirit is influencing us. But if what started off well in our thoughts and actions begins to be self focused or to turn us away from God, we should suspect that the ego spirit has somehow twisted the good beginning toward an evil direction and possibly even to an evil end. So we can discover that an originally good course of thinking, resolving, or acting has led us to be weakened spiritually or even to become desolate or confused. So this sense of confusion, I love that in the fundamental definition, Consolation, I am in sync with God's purpose for my life. And I know that because I have feelings of faith and hope and love. And the contrary is when I'm out of sync with God's purpose for my life, I feel doubt, despair, and fear. Um, I just find that really, really helpful. Of course, what he's adding with this idea of false consolation is sometimes I can feel faith and hope and love, even though I'm operating under the influence of my human ego. Um, Rule number six, and a reminder: 4, 5, and 6 are ways of working with false consolation. When we recognize that we have been duped by the evil spirit through a certain thought progression, we should review carefully all the stages which we pass through from the time that this process began. Um, by means of such a review, we will find we can more quickly catch ourselves when we are being led on by this deceit of the evil spirit, so that we're enabled to keep ourselves on guard. So I think you'll remember that when we're in consolation, we're feeling okay, we look back at the last time that we feel we went into desolation, and one of the translations calls it um, follow the serpent's tail. You're watching how the human ego um, took us from a fairly positive state down into the, well, we call it down the rabbit hole. You know, we watch how our thinking takes us down a rabbit hole, and it's only to be like an example for me would be as a result of a 4 column resentment inventory, I have learned, at least for me, that when I am angry or resentful about something, it actually means I'm frightened. The way my ego works, I usually feel the fear subconsciously, and my first responder to that fear is anger. So I've learned, even though I don't recognize the fear, that when I get angry about something or somebody or something somebody's doing, um, it's not about anger, it's about fear. And if I can get to the fear, um, then I have the opportunity to pray for the removal of that specific fear and ask for redirection. This has been huge for me, and where where it's just funny as you look over your resentment history. I would say, you know, my life was consumed with resentment to a large degree, and I really thought this is, you know, we talk about the dishonesty of resentment. That the first lie is I'm unhappy, but it's not my fault. It's your fault. If you would behave differently, I could be happy. And then the second lie is, so here's a really good idea. I'm going to hate you uh, until you feel that and you go, why is Jack hating me? And then you're going to look at your behavior and you're going to see what you're doing to make me angry, and you'll change. And then, as a positive effect of my resentment, you will behave better. You'll actually be a better person. I'll be happier, and the world will be a better place because I've resented you. Resentment is awesome. Uh, so that's the second lie. And then the third lie, I could never treat another the way you're treating me. I would never do that to another person. And actually, that's what gives me the right to resent you about it. So, uh, it's changed the way I think. Most of my resentments today are toward other people in AA. I get resentful when people show up late. I get resentful when people do shares that are, I think, confusing for newcomers or whatever. But it's just interesting, and usually at the heart of my resentment is you're not doing your job. Um, I know what your job is, and you're not doing it. And that's always tied to my ambitions. I want AA to be wonderful, and I get annoyed when somebody makes it less than wonderful. So I'm sorry to go off on that, but I do believe that my um, this period of depression, desolation, whatever you want to call it, um, not only was I to learn from this and to be put into a position to desperately ask God to restore me to sanity, because I could see the insanity of uh, depression, because you're basically useless, um, and that I needed to ask this power that I'm trying to relate to restore me to sanity. And it really has helped me see that in view of the steps, that the first thing we need to do is to um, see our powerlessness over our own personal insanity. And that's what we do when we inventory resentment, fear, and remorse around our selfish conduct. We are admitting to our powerlessness over our insanity. And then in steps 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, we're restored to having power over a sane experience. Although one of the things I just totally love about the 7th step prayer is that we're saying, I'm not going to judge my insanity. I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. Um, and I'm going to ask you to restore me to sanity only in terms of its usefulness to you and to my fellows, not to my personal feeling state. Um, that's huge. And I believe the way I get restored to sanity is through the amend process. That's where I actually need to ask higher power for both the guidance and the power to go to somebody and say what I've never been able to say in my personal case. I was wrong. I was not acting as the person that I want to be. And I believe that may have done some spiritual harm. I don't know. Um, so now I'm trying to make that right within. And my purpose is to be restored to sanity, um, and to be of more use to my creator. So I just the depth of what we do, it blows my mind. And I part of the tragedy, I think, of not that's too strong a word, but um, of people sitting in meetings of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, is a lot of people sitting there have not gotten either very far in step 4 and 5, or they haven't gone on from there. There are a lot of people that go through 4 and 5, get much more comfortable with themselves, and stop and never get to amends, never get to, or only partly get to, a restoration of sanity for the sake of being more useful to higher power. Um, so that's a paid political announcement, I guess you'd say. I don't know. Okay, so we're back. We got 2 to go. Uh, and that's rules 7 and 8. Um, so rule 7 is interesting. Second week, rule 7. As we continue to make progress in the spiritual life, the movement of the good spirit, and I'm calling that the soul, is very delicate, gentle, and often delightful. The good spirit touches us in the way that a drop of water penetrates a sponge, just softly soaks into a sponge. The evil spirit, or the ego's spirit, uh, does the reverse, tries to interrupt our progress. The movement is violent, disturbing, and confusing. Evil spirit touches into our lives is more like water hitting hard upon a stone. And I just, I just love that Ignatius, 500 years ago, was able to give us these visual, sensual images of um, of how the ego spirit works as opposed to how the good spirit or the soul spirit works. In persons whose lives are going from bad to worse, the descriptions above should be just reversed. The reason for this difference lies in the conflict of opposing forces. In other words, when the good or ego spirit finds our heart a true haven. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. This can be kind of confusing. So when the good spirit's operating, it'll enter quietly as someone coming through an open door of its home. The ego spirit in contrast, causes great commotion and noise as they try to enter into the heart of a just person intent upon the good. So they're just saying they're the reverse. The good spirit is gentle, like a drop of water on a sponge. The ego is coming in with great clamorings and disturbances in its way. And finally, rule number 8, when the consolation experience of our life comes directly from God, there is no deception in it. Another way this is said is it's beyond our ability to doubt. When we experience God directly, we don't experience doubt. I've described before, I believe, the times I have heard um, God's voice speak to me about something, give me some guidance directly. And one of them happened young, fourth grade, and the multiplication tables. And I heard a voice that said, "Pay attention to this stuff. It's going to be of great benefit to you later on." And it gave me the inspiration and I have made my life based on fundamental math schools, the skills that I learned in. But I had a lot of doubt about it. I heard it, my little brain is going, "What was that?" And I tried to explain it to myself because of the doubt. It's just where it is. So doubt is one of the things that helps us distinguish um, what we're going through. I'll go through again that. Um, the fundamental definitions that we've got. Um, Consolation, I am in sync with God's purpose for my life, and I will feel faith and hope and love. Um, Desolation, out of sync with God's purpose for my life, and I feel uh, just, let's see, doubt, fear, despair, the opposites of faith, hope, and love. Um, and I say again, the purpose for this stuff is that we uh, are able to use these rules for discernment, these techniques in the spiritual exercises to um, discern God's purpose for our lives, which I believe is the heart of step 11. And that when I'm in sync with that purpose, life goes very well. When I'm out of sync with that purpose, I don't feel real great. So I'm gonna stop shortly, and we're gonna have some open discussion. Have a 2-week break, and when we come back from that break in April, we're gonna start into this book, God's Voice Within, Mark Thibodeaux, and it has 3 parts. The first part is distinguishing these two, and that's another important thing. When we read, it comes from page 25 of the big book. Uh, if you're a real alcoholic, you only get these 2 choices. One is go on to the bitter end, trying to blot out of your mind how miserable you are. That's desolation. And the other is to accept spiritual help. That's what the big book says. In this case, what I'm saying is when I'm accepting spiritual help, I am inviting God into my life. I am feeling the effects of that. I'm in consolation, and I know I'm moving toward my Creator's purpose for my life. Um, and which I'm saying I believe is step 11. So Mark Thibodeaux's book, the first thing he's going to do is distinguish desolation and consolation. Um, Second thing he's going to do is how we respond once we know that, and we've been reading how to respond in these rules for discernment. And then finally, the third part of his book is how to use these rules to in our decision making process, and in particular trying to get closer to God's purpose for our lives. So I'm going to stop the recording and we'll have some open discussion, and I appreciate you all being here. Now let's see. Usually, oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you all very much.